Thanks, Greg. Thank you for the opportunity to chat to you today. I just wanted to start by acknowledging the Drought and Climate Adaptation Program, who have funded the work that I will be speaking about today. So that's a collaboration between DAF, DES and AgForce. So the three projects that I wanted to talk about was some social research that I conducted a few years ago with specialists who work with graziers, some more social research that was conducted by my former colleague Gillian Paxton around cultural aspects of drought preparedness and what some of those cultural factors are. And then finally, I wanted to finish up with some examples from a role that I'm undertaking at the moment, 2 days a week, which is to provide social and behavioural science knowledge support to the Drought and Climate Adaptation Program from both a decision support tool and extension perspective, and I'm going to focus on the extension stuff. And some of the techniques and approaches that we're using are applicable to industries broader than the grazing industry, as Greg just mentioned. So the first project, which was conducted back in 2016-17, was understanding the factors that limit decision-making for improved drought preparedness and management. Again, it was the grazing industry that we were focusing on, and as part of it, I spoke with primarily rural specialists, but also with some leading graziers as well. And at the time we did that, we focused on specialists at the time rather than graziers because we wanted to get a perspective. It's the sometimes you others know your situation or have insights into your situation that you might not have. So the second round of social research was with graziers, but this one was primarily with specialists, and we spoke to specialists who worked with graziers from both a productivity and profitability perspective. So agronomists, officers who were involved in the grazing best management practices when it was around, grazing supply chain processes and retailers, and then from a profitability perspective, bank managers, accountants and farm financial counsellors. So we got a range of those, and extension officers as well. So what we found that drought preparation is complex and it encompasses many factors that are interconnected, which would be of no surprise to any of you. Every property, every enterprise, every grazier is different, and this would apply to farmers, primary producers in general, so therefore there's no one size fits all. It wasn't clear what drought preparation, there was not a clear definition of drought and then what was meant by drought preparation at the start of this project. So I took some time to try and understand what was meant by drought and drought preparation. What I found from the specialists and the leading graziers that I spoke to was that they made a distinction between short-term dry periods and longer-term dry periods. So up to 2 years, in which they thought graziers are managing pretty well for dry periods that are up to 2 years. But once we get past that 2 years and into the longer-term dry periods, then it becomes very possible to manage well for that, if not impossible. So I started by looking at factors, both drivers and barriers, but then I particularly focused on the barriers because from a policy and government perspective, we're particularly interested in what are those barriers or constraints or factors that are limiting decision making so that we can then target our efforts to that. And I identified 6 areas or categories on which I grouped those limiting factors. And these are the 6 factors. I'm going to go into them in a little bit of detail just to give you a bit more of an example. But at the end of this presentation, I have a couple of links to the actual reports themselves from both social science reports, which are on the Long Paddock website, and I encourage you to have a look at them, and then if you have any more questions, you can come and talk to me. So the first one was the financial and economic situation, which really shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, and I'm sure it isn't. So within that, there were specialists and graziers spoke about financial pressure, the fact that a considerable percentage of the grazing industry is not financially viable. They're accumulating too much debt, combined with declining terms of trade. Many of the smaller enterprises don't have sufficient economies of scale. They don't have access to off-farm income, depending on where they are, especially if they're in more remote areas. And so then there is this reliance on cattle for cash flow. So you need to have cattle to have cash flow, which is the perspective. And also there was discussions around the role of international market restrictions. So the live export ban was also, a factor influencing that. Poor financial literacy was also discussed as being within that financial and economic situation. So many of the specialists, both from a productivity and profitability perspective, were concerned that some graziers didn't appear to know or understand their financial figures. They tended to focus on cattle prices and keeping stock without considering the full costs of production associated with keeping stock, and that they also on occasions used potentially biased sources of financial advice. So they might make decisions about when to buy or sell stock based on what their stocking agent had said, perhaps not realising that stocking agents have are motivated by slightly different agendas. So it's not completely unbiased and independent. So in terms of the consequences of this financial pressure for drought preparedness is that it leads to limited cash and cash flow for drought proofing, whether that be through infrastructure or improving or changing practices. And also it also led to overgrazing, so keeping stock, not destocking early during drought to then have the cash flow to meet ongoing financial commitments. The second area that we looked at was the nature of grazing production systems. So there are differences between the different primary production industries, but some things that are within livestock industries that are affecting a livestock industry's ability to manage for drought was the perceived resilience of grazing ecosystems. So the subtlety of landscape change that occurs because of degradation over time can be very hard for people to notice and see. So there was the specialists and the leading graziers thought some graziers within the industry thought that their grazing enterprises and their grazing ecosystems were very resilient, but perhaps not realising that, you know, they were slowly degrading their pastures and their ecosystems over time, and that was going to have a huge effect into the future. When exactly may not be known, but when it happened, it was going to be quite punishing. And so, not realising not realising the vulnerability and the degradation over time meant that some graziers were more comfortable with overgrazing when perhaps, you know, the overgrazing was causing considerable damage. The long cattle production cycles is also a factor. So we know from behavioural and social science literature too, decision timeframes and also the length of time between cause and effect has a big impact upon whether or not you can actually see that cause and effect. So, because livestock production cycles are over years, not just months, compared with, you know, other primary production industries such as, you know, horticulture or broadacre cropping, can make it really difficult to see that cause and effect, you know, based from, you know, poor management practices, again, such as overgrazing. In addition, the flexible decision windows, which in some ways can make grazing enterprises quite resilient, can also be an added factor which ultimately affects and increases the vulnerability of grazing enterprises. So because they have you know, flexible decision windows, again, compared with, for example, horticulture, where you have to harvest, you know, within a certain period of time, and the same with broadacre cropping, the flexible decision window of grazing creates delayed or enables delayed decision making, such as, for example, delaying your destocking, and then over time that ultimately reduces the vulnerability of the grazing reduces the resilience of the grazing ecosystem, and then over time will result in actually a reduced ability to withstand drought into the longer term. The management focus, record keeping, planning and decision making factors related to whether or not the property had a day-to-day operational management focus or a more strategic focus. So there was a concern that one of the factors that might be limiting drought preparedness is that many graziers focus on the day-to-day or operational aspects of their properties, you know, fixing fences, you know, looking after the day-to-day management of cattle. And then that actually takes up all of their mental energy as well. And so they don't have enough what we would call in behavioural science mental bandwidth to actually focus on making more strategic decisions. So it's a bit of that, you know, working in the business versus working on the business that you sometimes hear. Again, there was a cattle management focus as opposed to maybe thinking about pasture and then also soils and landscapes. There was a concern that there were low levels of record keeping, so similar to financial record keeping, low levels of herd records as well, you know, and also within that herd practices. So, you know, what numbers of certain types or classes of cattle that you had, and what sort of, you know, when, you know, the impact that then that has on your ability to manage your property. And then added to that is that by not having a clear set of focus, clear set of records, and that focus on individual day-to-day operational aspects, is that it can lead to a lot of stress, because, you know, managing properties under drought conditions is very stressful. And then we know that there's an established relationship between the more stressed you are, the lower your ability to make good decisions. It really compromises your decision-making capacity. And this is not just graziers, this is everybody. So another area was knowledge, willingness and capacity to learn and change. I'm just going to move to the other side of the table and come back to government involvement. So within that, again, we were talking about limited land and herd management knowledge and skills, particularly the land management, a varying or a variable willingness to learn and change. And again, that might be related to age in the life cycle of some of the graziers, and also where they are in terms of years out from either succession or exiting the industry if they don't have a succession plan in place. And also variable capacity to learn and change. So even though we know from a social science perspective that if people are willing to learn, you can learn at any stage. If people think if they don't have the self-efficacy, if they don't believe in their ability to be able to change, then they're not going to be able to. It's a bit of that growth and fixed mindset that some of the extension officers may be familiar with. And again, I can give you some more information about that. So personal attitudes and circumstances. There was a concern amongst the specialists in particular that there were quite disempowering attitudes towards drought. And interestingly enough, that came up again in Gillian's work. So I'll talk about that again in a minute. But, you know, as comments such as, well, how can you prepare for drought? Or we'll just get through. And again, this reliance on it's going to rain soon. So I'll talk a bit more about that with Gillian's stuff. There was also added to that the complexity of just primary production enterprises, you know, and particularly intergenerational family dynamics. So, you know, that can make decision making very complex. There's often many factors and many players involved in that, and so then that, you know, if your personal circumstance is such that you've got several generations, then that could potentially be limiting your ability to plan for drought. If, for example, some members of your family don't think you need to, you know, their strategy is to just continue to stock at quite a high rate, that can make it quite difficult. Finite physical capacity, you know, all all primary producers. The demographic of primary producers has changed over time. They're getting older. That's no different for grazing. So, their physical capacity is decreasing, and also combined with that, during drought conditions, people are very tired because they're working really long hours, and then that leads to increased exhaustion and subsequent physical and mental health issues associated with that. Combined with that, you've got limited social interactions when you are working so hard and such long hours during drought conditions, and then that has an impact upon your mental health. And then the final aspect within this area that I think is really important and worth mentioning is self-identity and rural lifestyle. Many graziers identify as cattle people, cattlemen, cattlewomen, and so then if they don't have cattle, what are they? And that is something that I think extension officers, may have an ability to influence, and we can talk a bit more about that later. So the government involvement was also the final factor that we identified as limiting drought, limiting decision making for drought. So the specialists and the graziers that I spoke to identified a distinction between Commonwealth and Queensland drought assistance. There was criticisms of the drought subsidies. However, there was sort of a mixed attitude or view towards some of the grants around emergency water rebates. So in some cases it was seen as a good thing, but in others they thought that it actually rewarded poor practice. People should already have emergency water infrastructure and resources, and as a consequence it sort of acted as a perverse incentive and was sort of discouraging people from proactively managing for drought in advance because they were waiting until they could access some of those grants. There was also concern that perhaps some of that drought assistance was actually prolonging the existence of financially unviable farming enterprises, and people were making poor management decisions regarding holding stocks so that they could then access fodder subsidies, when perhaps, when the best thing that they might be able to do is actually destock. There was also concern that it was really, some of these drought subsidies are really unfair to other rural small businesses who are also adversely affected by drought but can't access them. In terms of extension and independent service provision, and bear in mind this was conducted back in 16-17, but they thought that there was generally enough information and training resources. The one area where extension was really needed was more one-on-one support and service provision. But there was also acknowledgement that there are many graziers within Queensland who are not using extension or looking at best management practices. And again, that's probably not a surprise to anyone. And then the other aspect was we also talked about some seasonal climate forecasting tools, which I'm not going to talk about today, but I can certainly talk to people in a bit more detail about if they want. So the second project, which was actually conducted by my colleague Gillian Paxton, was Gillian took my work and she looked at it in a bit more detail and decided that, it'd be really good to understand what are some of the cultural factors. So I had looked at some of the broader financial, the way that grazing ecosystems are, the impact of government infrastructure and grants. But she was really interested in what are some of the cultural factors that influence decision making, and whether or not that can also, there are changes there that could be made that could improve drought management and resilience for grazing enterprises. The second part that I will talk about then is my role. I come back into it again 2 days a week, where I provide knowledge support, which is where basically, as part of that project that I had conducted in 16 and 17, I thought there's actually a lot of insights from social and behavioural science that I think could be applied not only to the development of decision support tools, but also to grazing extension services, and not just grazing extension, but because this project was focusing on grazing, I could see a direct link. So my role has been to provide support in kind 2 days a week over the life of the program. Gillian's work is now finished. She finished in 2019, but I'm still here and I'm still working. So if people have questions post this, you know, I'm still on this project. So as I mentioned, Gillian's aim was to explore the cultural factors and context. And by culture, she's talking about the culture within the grazing industry. I know that that word culture can be a bit confusing for people, so we've put a bit of a definition here. It's the shared and taken for granted ways that particular social groups, including communities, organisations and industries, live and operate together. And in this case, we're talking about the Queensland grazing industry. So it includes knowledge about shared beliefs, what is perceived to be true, and values, what is perceived to be important, practices, how we do things, and then material stuff too. So that could be tools and technologies and ways that things are done. So Gillian decided she would look at this from 2 different methods or 2 different ways so that she could get a much clearer picture of what was going on. So the first part was to conduct a discourse analysis, and as part of that discourse analysis, she looked at literally thousands of media articles that had come from Queensland Country Life, ABC, Rural, and also the Courier Mail, because she wanted to know the way that drought is represented in the media, and particularly the rural media where graziers and associated industry members and specialists might be reading, and then how that then influences their perception of what they consider drought to be and not to be. And then that what you consider drought to be then influences what we believe is possible, what we believe is desirable, and then thus how we think and how we act. So discourse can be incredibly powerful. The other thing that she did was that she conducted in-depth interviews with graziers. So graziers either as individuals or as grazing families. She spoke to them about their goals and their values, how they see themselves, what they understand drought and drought preparation to be, the ways and sources of information that they have or knowledge that they have in order to respond to drought and also to comprehend future drought risk, and then whether or not they thought that graziers thought that they could be supported to increase their drought preparation and build their resilience over time, and if they thought they could be by government, in what ways could they be supported? So Gillian identified 9 cultural factors that complicate drought preparedness. The first one was from the discourse analysis, and it was around competing messages about drought. So Gillian identified that there were basically 2 broad ways or framings of how drought is presented in the media, in mainstream media, but particularly those sources that we mentioned, and they had a strong rural focus. So she called one the battling adversity framing and the other one the managing business risk framing. The battling adversity framing was by far and away the most prevalent one. The managing business risk framing tended to be seen mostly in government and MLA and some of those sorts of sources. So the battling risk adversity really saw drought as a profound natural event, and it sort of identified that graziers were in a bit of what Gillian called an adversarial relationship with drought. So there was quite a lot of tension almost, and she spoke about how, for those of you who may have seen some of her presentations, some of the warlike language that came out in some of the media clips. Drought management and resilience was really seen as a matter of fortifying, fighting, enduring, and also gambling. And I think that enduring is quite interesting because when you have a look at resilience literature, or I've had a look at resilience literature in my role, there are a couple of different ways that you can see resilience, and some resilience can mean maintaining the status quo, sort of hunkering down, doing what you can to get through something so you can go back to the way that things are. But there's another way that it looks at resilience, and that is actually being adaptable and flexible and changing. And it's interesting that I'm also seeing some of those discussions happening now with COVID-19. You know, are we trying to go back to the way things were, or are we going to adapt so that into the future, you know, we know how to respond to these sorts of situations? So the exact same thing, you know, what are we presenting? What are we encouraging? Are we encouraging people to think about the ways that they might change and be more flexible into the future, or are we actually encouraging people to maintain the status quo through the language and the discourses that we use? The other thing too that sort of linked to that battling adversity was that it encouraged a lot of empathy and sympathy from politicians, from charities, from urban communities, from other rural communities. And so there was a lot of drought support, and, you know, hay being transported across the country, farmers and graziers being sent, you know, all sorts of things from personal hygiene products right through to you know, perhaps you know, money and donations. So the managing business risk framing, which is more likely to be seen in government literature, is far less prevalent, and that's like a major point that needs to be made. Gillian didn't try and put as like a quantifiable rate on it, because that wasn't the nature, but that was not the purpose of the exercise. But the point she wanted to make was that this battling adversity framing is far more prevalent, and you're far more likely to have read about that than this managing business risk. In fact, you would have to go looking to find the managing business risk. You'd be looking at government websites, looking at government documents, something that you're already sort of searching for anyway. And in this case, it was looking at drought being an ongoing and manageable risk facing graziers. It meant it encouraged graziers to engage professionally with respect to drought and drought management. There was a really strong focus on rational and strategic planning and decision making, and a real focus on, you know, knowledge, looking at your knowledge sources, relying and using scientific expertise and information to manage risk. And again, this is where some of those decision support tools came into effect, but ultimately it was seen as an individual's responsibility. There are pros and cons to both of these, but if we're interested in government in building the resilience, then the managing business risk framing is a much more empowering way to go. What the point of this particular table is to just demonstrate that some of what we know from behavioural science and good communication is that, you know, you tell stories, you emote, you use emotion, you link people, you make it really clear, you simplify messages, you use descriptive languages, you connect people with their communities, with their enterprises, with their industries. And the battling risk framing is doing that very well, and that is why it is such a powerful message, and that's why, and so powerful that people are, you know, making donations and sending hay from across the country. So there are some things that it is doing incredibly well, the way it is communicating. Unfortunately, the managing business risk, which is actually, we think, a much more empowering message, we're not actually using some of those techniques, those what we know to be good communication techniques. So we tend to use quite technical and, dare I say it, boring language. We focus on the individual, which can sometimes put a lot of responsibility on the individual. We completely miss out on linking it to social norms. So, you know, the fact that people are influenced by what their communities, what their peers are doing and saying. It can also really alienate people, especially when we focus on information and science and we don't acknowledge that it, you know, drought is difficult. So, you know, sometimes to be upfront about that, and this is particularly in conversations, you know, and I'm sure Extension Office are doing this, but with our publications, we don't tend to acknowledge that drought is difficult. We go straight into this is a manageable business risk. And, you know, it's actually really hard. And I know that no one thinks it's easy, but we would do better if we actually acknowledge that and then said, however, there are ways that, you know, we can work to, you know, prepare ourselves for drought. It also appeals to a very narrow set of values. So we tend to focus on the financial benefits, and I'm going to talk in the next slide a bit why that's a bit of a problem. It's a bit of a problem because there are actually many complex motivations that are driving graziers. There's definitely a financial element, but it tends to be more about financial security rather than just profit driven. And the reason why I said we're you know, just focusing on a narrow set is that there are actually many other values and motivators driving graziers that I think in our communication with them we could actually tap into. So talking about connecting with animals and the land, honouring history, tradition and their rural communities, really linking them with their communities and some of those social norms. You know, a lot of graziers really enjoy working for themselves, you know. There's a lot of ways we can communicate about drought resilience so that people can continue to be their own bosses, so that they can continue to be self-directed, and also the creative process of being your own boss and having your own business. We can also talk about, you know, linking a bit more with improving livestock and the property, because that is a value that is very important to graziers as well. So the point that Gillian was making is, you know, as we know, there are many motivations driving graziers, and this would also apply to other primary producers, but sometimes we tend to focus on the financial, and there's a whole lot of literature. In fact, there's a whole discipline called behavioural economics, which talks about the fact that, you know, we don't make decisions which are purely in our financial self-interest, and there's a lot of good reasons for that, and so perhaps we need to tap into some of those other drivers, other motivations, other values when we're communicating. Of the rest of the 9 cultural factors that complicate drought preparedness, the next one was this perceived distinction between drought and climate change. So although difficult, drought is often perceived to be part of a normal or balanced part of the cycle. So people were anticipating that it's going to rain soon. Graziers were anticipating that. The issue with that is that yes, the drought will eventually break, but the seasons are changing. The drought periods are getting longer, they're becoming more severe, they're happening more frequently. And so by not linking it a bit more closely with climate change, there's a concern that graziers, I should say, are making decisions expecting things to be as they always were, but when we know weather reports and are telling us that that's not the case. There's a reliance on more traditional forms of knowledge within some graziers. Some are active knowledge seekers. You know, with such a heterogeneous group, it's really hard to generalise, but it's impossible to generalise. But there was also acknowledgement that some are reliant on their own heuristics or rules of thumb that they've developed. The reason why this is potentially problematic is that the situation is changing, the climatic conditions are changing, and if your rules of thumb are based on historical data and not incorporating new information as it comes to light, which is actually required in such complex decision making, then perhaps your rules of thumb are not as valid as they could be. Remaining distrust of seasonal climate forecasting came up. So even though it was definitely perceived to have been improved over time, there was still a lot of frustration with what they described as inaccurate forecasting. And this could also be related to the fact that the way that forecasts are presented and communicated, and then how probabilities are actually interpreted and perceived. And so within that, within the knowledge support role, we've looked at some ways to address that, and I'll talk about that soon. Also, there was a perception about the timing and accuracy of forecasts. And then again, there's also this real reliance on emotional impacts of past predictions. So people tend to be very disappointed if the prediction is not accurate or doesn't be true as they perceive it. So there's some perhaps more educational communication around the fact that this is evolving. It's not an exact science, and it is not the panacea. It's part of a range of evidence to support good decision making. Difficulty managing uncertainty is an issue for everybody, but certainly within drought, there's a lot of complexity and uncertainty involved, and that even those graziers who had quite established strategies for managing drought, so clear decision windows, good decision rules, evidence-based decision rules, they were still concerned about whether or not they had made the right decision, even if their process had been very good. Are they making the right decision? Social constraints on innovation and adaptation, so within this point, Gillian said that some of the proactive graziers that she spoke to talked about feeling out on a limb with their communities because of social norms around discussing business, what you do and don't talk about, and then a reluctance to draw attention to perhaps people who are undertaking less desirable, or dare I say it, poor management practices, and also if you're seen to be doing something that's just a bit too out there or a bit, then a reluctance to talk about that too. However, they also placed huge value on finding like-minded people so they could expand their business and knowledge. They could expand their knowledge networks, and that sometimes those like-minded people were not within their industry or not within their region. Limited awareness of the full spectrum of drought preparation practices. So again, this was about focusing a lot on herd management, on infrastructural improvements, and then also a real fiscal conservatism, so a frugalism, but less connection made between land and pasture and soil management as a way of preparing for drought. The expectations for drought support amongst graziers, whilst many saw drought preparation as an individual responsibility, which is interesting, there was definitely support for government subsidies, and in particular those infrastructural improvements, so the emergency water grants, which is a bit different to what came out with the specialists. Some of the specialists were concerned that some of those emergency water grants, there was a mixed response there. While they thought it was good, they were concerned that it was discouraging some people from making decisions earlier about infrastructural improvements, but overwhelmingly graziers seemed to be very supportive of that. Although there was an acknowledgement that some of the subsidies, and again relating to fodder, might legitimise some practices that perhaps aren't ideal. And again, that was looking at some of those fodder and freight subsidies. So now I just wanted to focus on the behavioural and social science knowledge support role that I have been undertaking. So as I mentioned before, this came about because after the first project, I really thought there was some insights from behavioural and social science that could be applied to drought and agriculture and natural resource management that perhaps hadn't been. So the way that I've been providing knowledge support to both extension officers and tool developers has been either through using behavioural and social science methods, so in particular surveys and focus groups or interviews, but also I've had a look at quite a number of concepts, frameworks and processes. I just want to be clear, behavioural and social science is a huge area. There's many disciplines. It's a bit like saying looking at insights from biophysical science, but I decided to narrow down to a few areas that I thought were particularly relevant. So again, the behavioural economics that I spoke about. I've been looking at some insights that I think are relevant from social psychology, user and human-centered design, in particular with the decision support tools. I've been looking at social marketing techniques because that's around marketing has added some really good insights around how you might change behaviour, because marketing behaviour has been changing behaviour through marketing has been so successful. So why don't we learn from some of those? And then also, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of insights about behaviourally informed communication techniques. So, linking to people's values, using emotive language, telling stories. And some extension officers are well aware of this. So it's not necessarily something that I need to talk to you a lot about. So as part of that, I've developed some Excel databases, and I've been working with Grazing Futures staff in the 3 regions so Northwest, Central and Southwest, to try and go through and work out for their various areas and the topics that they want to focus on, how we might be able to use some of those insights from the databases, because there's too much for a person to go away and look at on their own. So I'm starting to then take some of those insights and form fact sheets and guides, user guides, webinars, workshops, depending on what people want and what they want to focus on. I also looked at behaviour change interventions, and this is where I think there's also some great insights that could be useful to agriculture and natural resource management extension. So I've created a database of over 500 different types of what we call interventions, but basically are techniques or tools or strategies or instruments, and also design elements that encourage behaviour change. But in the social and behavioural science literature, they're called interventions. So some of them will possibly be used by some extension officers, and in that case I'm thinking about things like decision aids such as checklists and cheat sheets or decision trees. Then choice architecture, so how you frame messages. Are you linking with social norms? Are you using defaults to make it easier for people? But there are also some other things that I think could be really quite easily used by extension officers. So within that, there's some mental contrasting activities, implementation intentions, which are if-then plans, if people have heard of that, using planning prompts, cues and reminders, whether that be text messages or emails or phone calls. Reference class forecasting, where you look at the future and you predict it by looking at past situations, so getting people to think about, how did they manage for this in the past, what worked well, what didn't work well. Perhaps you can develop a plan for the future taking into account, because that makes it a lot easier for people. And because all of us, not just graziers, tend to underestimate the costs of things, the completion times, the risks associated with certain actions. So if we can actually compare how things have worked in the past, we've got a much better way of doing things into the future. So this is just a bit of a slide about what behavioural insights are for those who aren't familiar. It's not regulation, it's not an incentive in terms of financial incentive, and it's not pure information provision. It's really looking at another technique, and again, it's not that this is to replace those, not at all. It's to actually complement these traditional policy approaches or behaviour change approaches. So as I said, it's things like message framing, prompts, using commitment devices, but generally they're not very expensive and they're relatively easy to implement, and that's again another reason why I think there's some real benefit here for extension officers. So I'm just looking at the time. I'm going to try and speed up a little bit so that I can get through some of the stuff that I think is relevant. So there are many different ways that you can apply insights and interventions, and there are actually some really good guides. You might be familiar with the term nudge, mind space, which goes into, breaks it down into all those different messenger incentives, norms, defaults, making it salient, priming, effect, commitments, and ego. Simpler is another way. I just wanted to talk very briefly about EAST as an example, to make it easy, timely, social, and attractive. Actually, easy, attractive, social, and timely. So in terms of making it easy, remove friction associated with it. So friction are those sort of small hassle factors. So make easy access to information, simplify the information, use guides or instructions, have ready-made ready-made decision templates, try and streamline any bureaucratic procedures or processes that graziers might have to go through. In terms of make it attractive, you know, try and use, again, simple language, you know, attract people's attention to, you know, make your templates where you provide information easy to read. Try and use infographics or diagrams where you can, always much better. Social, draw on people's, we are social creatures, so link it to people's social peers, to their communities, to other graziers. Show that other people are performing the desired behaviour, and I know that many of you are doing that, particularly through your case studies, but really use the power of networks, and then encourage people to make a commitment to their actions, to either you as extension officers or others, ideally to other peers, because some of that public commitment is actually a very strong driver for behaviour change. Timely, provide people with information when they're most likely to be receptive or responsive to it. Sometimes in the middle of drought, when people are already very tired and very stressed, we're trying to get them to think about drought planning, and, you know, the horse is bolted in that sense. You know, people are already in the middle of it. It's not necessarily time to be thinking about planning, or perhaps some of that long-term strategic. In that case, it's about giving people information that's directly relevant to what they're doing now. Also, behaviour is generally easier to change when habits are already disrupted. So if people have had major life events, and that could be, you know, perhaps they've recently gone through a succession process and inherited the property, or become the new lead decision maker on their property, or, you know, from a more sadder perspective, they might have had a marriage breakdown, but the dynamics of the decision making has changed. That's also a time when people are more open to change. So perhaps capitalising on that in terms of that could be a good time to present people with information, and help people to respond to events, you know, which of course we're trying to do. So an example, just quickly, of how I'm providing knowledge support to the decision support tool developers is through the pasture growth alert. I provided some feedback, some of that behaviourally informed communication about, you know, the way that you present information. Are the colours that you use intuitive? Are the diagrams, you know, useful? Are they easy to read? Do they make sense? And then many of you hopefully are aware of a rainfall percentile animation that we did. When I say we, I mean Grant Stone from Des and I, but again, through funding through the Drought and Climate Adaptation, we have now received some funding to extend that to 2 more percentiles. Sorry, 2 more animations. So we're looking at maybe one being statistical and another one being cultural. If you haven't already seen that animation, I would really encourage you to get online and have a look at it. Grant and I and Tessie, the animator, and also Neil Cliff, are actually in the process of putting together some ideas and starting to storyboard our next animation. So if you've got some burning ideas, please get in contact with me. An example where I'm providing knowledge support role is to extension officers is through tailored presentations. So recently I was up in Cloncurry where I gave a presentation about behavioural finance, which is an area, a sub-area within behavioural economics, and how that some of the insights from behavioural finance might actually influence or might actually be relevant to cattle destocking decisions. So, so as part of that exercise, we looked at 4 concepts that I thought were particularly relevant. We only stopped at 4 because I had a limited period of time, but my intention is to actually put together a bit of a fact sheet so that this can go a bit broader than that group. And we looked at confirmation bias, endowment effect, herd behaviour, and sunk cost dilemma. And then as part of the exercise, I got people to think about how they might have demonstrated this particular concept or bias in their own, and then how they think graziers might be demonstrating that with their destocking decisions. And then finally, we finished up with a group exercise using some research around how you might gently challenge people's views on some of their destocking decisions with some really good questions. And then another example I wanted to use was customer journey mapping. So customer journey mapping is actually a technique from user-centered design, but it's existed within the marketing area for quite a long time. It's well established, and it's over 50 years old, and it's actually a really good systematic approach to understanding decisions. And it was interesting when I looked at it and thought, oh, I think there's some applicability here to extension. I actually found one paper that was produced last year in the United States where someone else had a similar thought, that, you know, there's some real applicability here to extension. So I can send you a copy of that paper, and I can also talk to you a bit more about what I did if you would like some more information. But we went through and did an empathy map to start with, where we described what we knew about the user. So just as a way of context, the Southwest Queensland grazing futures staff were really keen to look at ways that they could assist graziers to adopt early weaning in their region a bit more. And one of the reasons why they were interested in early weaning was they thought it was a relatively simple behaviour change with respect to the fact that people have to wean anyway. So what we're really doing is asking graziers to just wean a bit earlier. So perhaps that shouldn't be that hard. So what we did as part of the customer journey mapping is we actually used a systematic approach or process to actually document and understand the different steps or stages involved in actually making the decision to adopt early weaning. And when we looked at that, we actually realised it's far more detailed and involves far more resources and potentially practices in terms of changing your pens and your troughs so that, you know, younger cattle can access it. So there is some expense associated with that too. So it's not quite as straightforward. And that was a pretty valuable exercise for those extension officers. Then we started to look at what we called the key touch points. So what are those steps in that process where extension officers are actually in a position to be able to influence or work with graziers, whether it be through knowledge provision, whether it be through going out and having a one-on-one face-to-face discussion, whether it be about providing decision aids, such as, you know, an easy way to calculate, you know, the feed requirements involved if you're going to early wean, or perhaps acting as a check, so someone who can go through your figures and check to see if it was okay. As part of those touch points and channels being the way that you actually do it, whether it be through written material or face-to-face or, you know, decision aids, was we actually looked at what are the pain points, and by that we mean, are there any particular barriers or frustrations or annoyances that make it difficult at that point for graziers to work with us? Could it be they have difficulty accessing practical information, there is a lack of one-on-one extension, there's a lack of money, in which case there might be some opportunities to link them with financial incentives. Is there actual difficulty calculating feed budgets? Is there a lack of information, access to information on social media, or perhaps we're not aware of other people who are doing it, so we're not actually tapping into the social, you know, that social norm, so perhaps we could promote people who are doing it. And then the second part of that was to actually look at the gain points, so positive, enjoyable things that could be done to improve the process for graziers. So can we make information more available to people as they need it? Can we provide easy to read resources? Can we provide sufficient report support and interact with graziers when they need, you know, by going out and having that face-to-face visit, or providing that decision tool, you know, like a quick calculator of how you might be able to determine the feeding requirements, so that you can actually assist graziers better. So as part of that, we came up with this image on the bottom right, which is where we've looked at different ways for the steps involved. So the purple are the key touch points, and then different ways that you could be involved. I'm aware that I'm running out of time, so there are a couple of references to 2 reports. People have asked for whether you might be able to find them. Please have a look at them, and then any questions and answers. And if I don't get a chance to answer them today, stick them in an email, and I'm happy to look at them.